Good evening, everybody, to the last Ian Ramsey Centre seminar, Science and Religion of the Term. I'm very happy today to introduce you to Dr. Adam Grimm, who is a Templeton postdoctoral researcher at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. He did his doctoral studies at St. Louis University under Eleanor Stump, the same as Dr. Andrew Pinsent, who you very well know. Dr. Grimm's doctoral thesis was on virtue epistemology of the knowledge of persons. And today, himself and Dr. Andrew Pinsent will speak on neurotheology and the social brain. So they'll discuss significant insights from the cognitive science of religion, and they'll try to show how recent work in neuroscience and social cognition can also provide important insights into long-standing challenges in supernatural or revealed theology, and citing some examples of recent research into the role of metaphor and the second-person perspective. I'm also very happy to say that today the event is acting as the book launch of Dr. Pinsent's new book, The Second-Person Perspective in Aquinas Ethics. So now I pass it on to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For what it's worth, I bought a copy of the book. So today we're going to be talking about more cognitive science of religion than pure applied neuroscience. And the cognitive science of religion is a sort of interdisciplinary area that mixes, as you can see, it mixes anthropology, cognitive and evolutionary psychology, and only neuroscience really when it can. And the cognitive science of religion has gotten a lot of sort of popular press due to its association with the new atheist sort of movement. But that sort of connection isn't necessary. The method that is used in the cognitive science of religion is basically abduction and looking for the cognitive subsystems that we'd expect creatures like us to have, where creatures like us is in reference to creatures that are getting their hardware from the Pleistocene. I always horribly mispronounce that name. So the question I want to ask tonight is the antagonistic relationship necessary, or could CSR actually enhance a religious perspective on the world, even a religious perspective doing theology itself? So in the first half of the talk, what I want to do is look at some different things in the cognitive science of religion that are going to help us to understand the natural knowledge of God. And then in the second half, we're going to kind of put it together a bit. Okay, so in particular, we're going to look at three things. Namely, things that CSR has to say about religious experience, things it has to say about religious reasoning, and things it has to say about ways that practitioners of a religion tend to deviate from the official dogma, kind of standard patterns that tend to manifest themselves in the way that people talk and act that don't necessarily match with the official positions of their religion. So what do we mean by the social mind? Well, there's a big debate over what's called mind reading. In psychology, it's usually referenced as theory of mind, as to how it actually works. But any plausible theory has at least these two components. There is an agency detection part, and then there's a more abstract part, where you're reasoning about mental states. You may have heard about mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are all the rage these days. They're neurons that, for example, would encode both you're reaching for, say, a raisin and you're watching someone else reach for a raisin. So mirror neurons appear to be part of the agency detection system, most likely. And mirror neurons seem to be active from the get-go. They can be trained, interestingly, but they seem to be kind of part of the basic package. But there's some other things, things like the false belief task, that tend only to pick up after several years of development. Now, 3.5, you develop the ability to kind of keep track of when someone has a false belief and explain a state of affairs, use that knowledge of the false belief in explanations of behavior. So, for example, here you have someone switching a candy bar from where the kid has hidden it, and then we ask, where's the kid going to look? Younger children are just going to point out where it actually is, but the more advanced thing is to kind of represent the abstract, as it were, what the kid's going to think, and realize that the kid's going to look in the green box. Now, you might think that there must be more to the social mind than just agency detection and reasoning about mental states. For example, these two sets of abilities don't seem to necessarily cover social interaction, but if you look at the literature, complex patterns of interaction do seem to be pretty key to how it is that we reason, that we discover things about the social mind. But it's at least agency detection and reasoning about mental states. Okay. So what does CSR have to say about the agency detection part? Well, one of the big things that helped to launch CSR as a new field was the work of Stuart Guthrie. He has a book, I guess, from 1993 called Faces in the Clouds. And this is taking a very sort of traditional line about religions. Xenophanes famously talks about how horses would think of their gods as having a horse-like shape, right? And there's been plenty of people down through the ages who have said that we kind of project ourselves into the cosmos and try to explain religion that way. But what gave this a new twist was an evolutionary spin. The idea that seeing ourselves, writ large in nature, might be the sign of something adaptive, something that would help us identify predators or potential prey. If you're inclined to think every third boulder is actually a bear, that's better adaptive-wise than thinking that every third bear is a boulder. Okay, and as further work has revealed, it's not quite right to call it anthropomorphic. It's more like agent-pomorphic. It ends up that it has more to do with seeing agency everywhere than necessarily seeing humanity in particular. And in fact, whereas a traditional sort of anthropomorphic theorist might think of children thinking of gods as adults in the sky, some interesting experiments with Justin Barrett seem to indicate something of the opposite, that the concept of agency that the child applies to God, they apply to their parents as well, but then they learn that the parents have limitations, and they sort of put boundaries and restrictions on the adult concept, having to kind of whittle it away to finite proportions, whereas the agency concept they started with is going to fit better all the way along with the concept of God, especially like a Christian God. Various experiments have shown that it doesn't take a lot for us to see agency in places, to treat things like they're agents. I don't know if any of you have passed through a mall or something like that and thought there was an agent next to you, only to realize that it's a mannequin. Point light experiments have shown that just some light points on a dark background, if they're in the right proportions to a body, and if they move in the right way, we automatically can see those as a person. In fact, we can pick out different actions that they might be doing and pick out what emotions that person might be feeling. There's some interesting experiments with autism that have to do with that. And similarly, when shapes move in a kind of a self-propelled motion and in a way that's conditioned by other to the movement of other seemingly self-propelled geometric shapes, we interpret them as agents. Okay. The partner in the agency detection realm of HAD is artificialism. Whereas with HAD, what we're doing is we're attributing agency to things in our environment. Artificialism has to do with detecting signs that an agent was present, or signs that something is designed. And yes, I think I left your name off it, but I think you wrote the article as well up here, so I apologize for that. But there seems to be a natural tendency, at least in Western children, to recognize, that adults make things like chairs and things like cars, but it doesn't take much for them to pair God or gods with natural objects and talk about them in the same sort of way that they talk about the relationship between adults and chairs and things like this. So on the one hand, there is an easily triggered sort of tendency to see agency everywhere, as it were. There's also a tendency to see things as designed, as the product of an agency, even if the agent is not present anymore. Okay, what about religious reasoning? There is a story that often gets told in this literature, an anecdote about an anthropologist who's with a tribe when a hut falls on a family. And the anthropologist is kind of debating, I guess, with the native about why this has happened. And the indigenous person is saying that the gods are responsible for this, that maybe the family has done something bad, and this is vengeance or something like that. But the anthropologist draws attention to the fact that termites were involved, and you can see that from the wood. I mean, surely we have an easy, sort of scientific non-God explanation at hand. But then the person he's dialoguing with just kind of says, no, I mean, obviously the termites ate it out, and that's why it collapsed. So the question is, why did it happen right then? And so what CSR shows or highlights in religious reasoning is a tendency to look not just for causal structures, but rather for explanations in terms of motivation, you might say, that stand above or behind these causal structures. It's not necessarily that the explanations are instead of scientific explanations, but even when a seemingly satisfactory scientific explanation is put forward, there's a tendency to want more, to want to explain certain sorts of things, misfortune and fortune being chief amongst them, in terms of them happening for a purpose, in terms of them being revelatory of the motivations of some other kind of being. Scott Atran does some interesting work in which he tries to fit the way people talk about gods into a kind of predator-protector-prey schema. It's as if people have this sense that there are more powerful beings out there, and they try to identify the ones that might be predators and ward those off, identify those that might be protectors and curry their favor, and of course, sometimes you're trying to keep a being. So sometimes those categories can have a fuzzy boundary. Another sort of helpful analogy that organizes the way people do their reasoning about invoking the gods is it's almost like the god acts as the alpha of a pack. If you read about wolf packs, the alpha wolf will be doing two things within the pack. On the one hand, he polices the relationship between the other wolves and makes sure no one's going to hurt anyone else and damage the viability of the pack. So there's a kind of interest in keeping peace. But on the other hand, there's also a self-interested sort of defense of their place on top of the pack, and a high interest in being respected, by everyone who's in the pack. And so you can also get a lot of explanatory purchase by thinking of divine beings in various religions this way as well. They're always mixed up with morality and social mores, oftentimes policing those mores for reasons that differ religion to religion. But interestingly, the mores always most interested in are those kind of have to do with respecting the social privileging of the gods on top of the social hierarchy. The third area has to do with what's called theological incorrectness. This is sometimes colorfully called the tragedy of the theologian. The tragedy of teachers everywhere, I guess. You try and you try to give them these pristine, detailed structures, and they boil it down to a phrase and go their merry way. So it's the divide between what's theologically correct and the way people actually talk and act. So some of the experiments with this will be things like you might quiz somebody on their theological beliefs, and they'll say perhaps that God is omnipresent or that God is omniscient or something like this. But when you give them experimental conditions that allow them to not think abstractly and give their reflective answer, but to give more of a real-time answer, they talk as if God has to do one thing before he does another thing, like God is located. They talk basically as if God is much more like a generic this-worldly agent than a philosopher's God that's only vaguely related to agents down here. So, okay. One of the let me just touch on this example. So Emma Cohen studied the Afro-Brazilian possession cults in Brazil. And so an interesting instance of theological incorrectness is the head of the cult house explains that how this really works is that the spirit that possesses someone and the person that's already there kind of have an intermingling, and this intermingling is what allows for the fact that the same spirit in this person might look different than in this person. And the person that's possessed may keep some of the traits they had before they were possessed and things like this. So there's this kind of interesting philosophical, theological sort of explanation, like mixing two liquids to form a new liquid, albeit temporarily. But people don't act and talk as if that's the case, as she found, because that's just a bit too complicated. It doesn't cohere well enough with the way we normally think about folk psychology. So instead, they talk and act as if one person matches one body at all times. So if we're going to talk about the possessed person, the spirit that's doing the possessing, we're going to treat them as the only thing that's there. And if if we are going to treat the original person as being the person that's at home, well, then they must not be possessed right now. Okay, so what's interesting about this theological incorrectness is it shows a pattern where people will boil things down to minimally counterintuitive agents. They can't hold on to things that are too complicated. But of course, if it's run-of-the-mill ordinary, then it's not interesting enough to really grab you. So it has to be somewhat counterintuitive. But what's interesting is although you will see minimally counterintuitive things that are not agents, the vast majority of the things that people grab onto, that people focus on within religion, and when they're making these patterned errors, are particular kinds of agents with interesting properties that tweak them, make them different than the normal agents we encounter on a day-to-day basis, but not so different that we can't identify with them anymore. So, as a little illustration before we move on, take a carnivorous plant. If someone described a carnivorous plant to you, it might, grab your imagination. Something like, you might come up with a mental image, something like this, and it would probably be more likely to be something you thought was significant, something you might roll into your myths or something. But the more it becomes familiar, the more it becomes something like this, the less it dominates your cognitive space, the less likely it is to feature in your myths, the less likely it is to be something that you think about the significance of. It just becomes a feature of the world. All right. So let's move on to the second half. So within Christian thinking, this passage from Romans 1 has been the one that's perhaps been most prominent in people thinking about the natural knowledge of God, people thinking that there has to be some, and that it's somehow different or impoverished vis-a-vis revealed knowledge. Now, let's just read it real quick and then we'll move on. So this is from Romans 1. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Okay. When seen through a CSR lens, a number of things stand out. The first thing that stands out is that the passage is universal. It's not talking about some particular set of people. It's not saying everybody has a disposition that they can act on in the right circumstances. It's talking about something that should be universal in application, which matches up in interesting ways with the CSR focus on what Jesse Baring would call the God instinct. Or at least I think that that was the title of his book in Britain. I think it's The Belief Instinct in the States. A second thing that stands out is an emphasis on awareness of the invisible. Although you certainly see visible gods or gods that are said to be visible in various religions, CSR has focuses on the hard on things like had that are, if they have an evolutionary explanation, it would be tailored toward hard-to-detect predators. Predators and prey that are practically invisible. And the thought is that these sort of cognitive capacities are also in play when we're talking about religious experience. Another interesting thing that stands out is an emphasis on what exactly is known. It doesn't say that, God being love is something that's accessible everywhere. It doesn't say lots of things, that God being simple or outside of time. What it does say is that what's keyed in on universally is God's power and his position of rank or authority. That's how I'm interpreting the Godhead bit. And that matches up interestingly with the sort of universal traits the CSR tries to identify of, it matches up with God as acting like the alpha of the pack, that is interested in in social order and is interested in being respected as the key top person atop the social hierarchy and has the power necessary to back that up. Another thing that's worth noting is it locates the problem not in religiosity but in something else. And then lastly, there's an expectation that the awareness of this incorruptible God should be mixed up with thoughts of various kinds of creatures. So there's an anticipation of some sort of anthropomorphizing, but also of other creatures as well, which is interesting. And this contrasts with some of the ways that this passage has been used as a basis for philosophical theology in the past. So for example, the medievals, and Aquinas in particular, thought that what this passage demonstrates is that natural reason can attain to divine truths. So for example, in the lead-up to Aquinas' 5 ways, we get various quotes relating philosophy to this knowledge of God referenced in Romans 1, as if what philosophy does, philosophy is the culmination of this ability to reach philosophical propositions about God's existence, albeit general ones, through natural reason alone. This also contrasts interestingly, if slightly more subtly, with Calvin, and who supposed that we had a sensus divinitatis, an inborn sense of the divine that is not dependent on experience. He does admit for some artificialism, for some ability to tell that there is a creator from the creation. And for him, the philosophers, again, are the prime example of how this knowledge is corrupted. So he's kind of the opposite of Aquinas in that way. And one way I think that I think Calvin perhaps is closer to some of the things we learned from CSR than Aquinas on this particular point. But what's interesting to me is that the sensus divinitatis for Calvin is a special, unique thing, whereas with CSR, what that seems to suggest to us is that it's something that we use all the time. It's the social brain being taken up into another mode, as it were, that is more responsible for a lot of things the sensus divinitatis is supposed to be doing. Okay, so let me kind of end with the next 2 slides by kind of giving you a big picture way of capturing what, from a Christian theological perspective, one could learn from CSR when reasoning about the natural knowledge of God. The thing to notice is that the social brain is being used as kind of an instrumentalist capacity. When you look at the things that most religions have in common, and you look at the form that religious practice tends to take when people boil it down and use it, is they're using their social brain, but they're using it, for example, in the prey-protector predator schema, they're using it in order to secure goods in this, goods down here, as it were, or goods that are like the goods down here in the next life, and to protect themselves. Whereas on the Christian story, the revealed God is supposed to be continuous with the naturally revealed God in some way, but it's supposed to go beyond. And using CSR as a backdrop, you can form the following thought as to how that might work out. That maybe the thought is that the social brain is intimately involved in all religion and in natural knowledge of God. But on the Christian story, what's supposed to happen is that you're supposed to not just use the social brain for this worldly goods anymore, or for acquiring what are like this worldly goods in the afterlife, but rather the relatedness to the divine that the social brain brings about is supposed to switch from being a means to being an end. That's the kind of the paradigm shift that's supposed to come with the jump from natural religion to revealed religion, is one where we moved from the ends that fallen creatures naturally pursue, and even pursuing those through our attempts to manipulate or curry the favor of the gods, to having the relationship with the divine be the end itself. And so the idea is that on the revealed picture, the social brain is set free, as it were. So there's your final slide. Thanks for your time.